Start recording. Okay, welcome to everybody to Boston Groovy Grails Meetup, B2GS. We've had some technical difficulties, obviously, because YouTube decided they didn't want our stream. I'll post the video later since I'm actually recording it, and we'll go with that. So I'd like to thank Nielsen for hosting us and for refreshments, as always. And pizza. Other than that, I think we'll just go to announcements. So if anyone has job announcements, which I know Nielsen does, so we'll go with that right now. And Anush?
So currently we have this job, which as you can see on the screen, QA automation engineer. So we're looking for somebody with at least 1 or 2 years of experience, not senior but not junior as well, so somewhere in middle. So most of the responsibilities will be development of automation, manual testing, and working with offshore teams, onshore teams, and basically managing the team as well. So multitude of responsibilities will be there. So please get in touch with me or Tucker, who has my email address.
Yeah, I can forward it to you. So I know where you are.
Yeah, and it's job will be in Malton.
Okay, cool. Anyone have any other announcements or anything? I have a few of my own, but anyone else have anything else? Doesn't look like it. Okay, so for me, I'll make my general plea of we need speakers. I know at least 2 people from the answer section said that they would be interested in giving talks. Rick, I remember you as being one of them. Yes. So, whenever you finish it, let me know and we'll figure out a time and get you scheduled. But like, if you have experience with like, a plugin, a library, a framework, related to Groovy, Grails, or Spring that you've either worked with, used or created, we would love to have you as a speaker. So, other than that, another thing that's of note that's coming up, shortly is the G3 Summit, and I will be there, and hopefully learning lots of new stuff and interacting with them. I don't know if anyone else here is going, but I know you're going. I work with you. Oh, you're going. So, all right, cool. So I guess that's it for announcements. So let's get into Compiletime metaprogramming. So let me switch the recording to video because I actually have it. So last time when I gave the talk about metaprogramming, I showed you that metaprogramming was just a trick, and then I showed you how the trick was done. So, it's not like it's really magic once you know how the trick is done. Now, this part, there's probably like a 50-50 chance I'm going to screw this up, but I'm going to try to take it one step beyond, and that's where I get stuck because I'm not that good at sleight of hand. But anyways, and show you that, compile-time metaprogramming is just another way of programming. It's a little different. It's not for the faint of heart because the only people who really do this that I've seen are the people who write plugins, write the frameworks, and stuff like that. But it isn't really all that bad. There are some things that I'll show you here, like how to debug it, how to get into it, how to see what other. Basically, I'm going to be going into the AST Transforms side of this. So how you can look at what those AST transforms are actually doing to your code, and if you want to debug them. So on that note, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of AST transforms. So advantage is there's no runtime performance penalty like there is for runtime metaprogramming. You can simplify code a whole lot by which Groovy has done with like built-in things like @toString and stuff like that. It helps remove boilerplate code. and reduce errors by like providing like an implementation that's already solid. Like I think they have an annotation that does singleton. So rather than writing singleton for the 100th time, you just you just do the annotation and it handles that for you. The downside, the documentation in the API is kind of lacking. That's one thing where you have to kind of fiddle with it and figure out what things do based on what they say they are. And sometimes when you're actually debugging, well, how code can say it's doing one thing and do something else. It can be hard to get help because even on Slack, I've tried to get answers for some of my questions, and usually they just go unanswered because I think the people who have given actual talks on this are like all the top tier Groovy Grails developers, and it's like getting their time can be somewhat hard. But with this talk, I'll try to give you like a good start so that you'll have something that you can play with at least. The code is actually a little bit more verbose than writing just plain Groovy code. It'll look a little bit more Java-ish, even though you can take advantage of a lot of what Groovy has to offer. It's a lot of calling into the APIs, so it's a little bit harder to maintain. Now there are actually several different ways to write AST transforms. The code I'm going to show is mostly just using the pure API. There is a DSL. There's also special things that allow you to create them from like a string or from code. I've had mixed results with those in the past, so I primarily stick to just using the API. And then like later on, I'll talk about something that's coming up in the future. So one of the things you're probably wondering is, what the hell is an AST transform? So basically, when you write code, what you write is a bunch of text, and basically your computer has no idea what that is or what to do with it, so you compile it, and with Groovy there's a parser called Antler, which parses in your Groovy text into what's called an abstract syntax tree, which is why AST transform isn't...
Can you zoom in?
Sure. These are just my notes, which if you go to the link on in the Meetup, you can get these if you want to look at those later. But basically, I'm just having these up here just for my own memory. After I get through some of the just theory stuff, I'm going to go more into code anyways. So anyways, with the once Antler gets it in, like it goes through several different compilation phases, and basically Groovy allows you to tap into these and modify the abstract syntax tree using a transform. Now there's two types of these. Local, which is done with an annotation, so like the ones of, like say @toString or stuff like that. Those are called local AST transforms, and then there's a global AST transform, which hits every class that's in your compilation path. The downside to global one is you potentially you're going to make your compilation longer or add stuff to classes you don't necessarily want to add to if you're not careful with what you're doing. Within that, there are the compilation phases, which I mentioned, and these are just a list of them, just for you to look at. But the two phases that we're going to look at, that most of the API for the AST transforms hit, is semantic analysis and canonicalization. The rest of them, some of them are a little too early for you to start messing around with unless you're actually doing stuff at the compiler level, and some of them are a little too late too, unless you're really good. And like I know that the compile static annotation, because I was looking at it trying to debug why it was conflicting with one of my annotations, that happens at instruction selection. So these are the different phases that you actually will hit, that the Groovy compiler will hit. So steps for writing an AST transform. These are just some steps that I put together because I thought it might be a good idea, like some better practices now that I've gone through this several times, things that I haven't adhered to. But one thing I would say is try to write the code that you want your AST transform to accomplish first. Have that code, because then you can take that into the Groovy console and see what that actually builds up for you. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Take note of like the inputs and outputs, because basically with your AST transform you can provide parameters. There are some limits to what you can provide. Like anything like a string, a boolean, stuff like that. You can provide closures, but like I probably wouldn't have it giving like complex types. You probably could, but you're getting into more interesting territory. So let's see. Another thing I was thinking about. Well, with one of the transforms I wrote called Enforcer, or actually it's Enforce for the Enforcer plugin, what I figured out was I didn't need to do all my code in the AST transform, and I actually had it delegate to a call to just a service. So sometimes not putting your code in the actual AST transform but delegating out to another service might save you some time and headache with things that are harder to actually code in the AST. Then after you have that, after you go through that, you write the AST transform. I'd look at it in the Groovy console AST browser, to see, is it doing what I think it's supposed to be doing? Is it writing the code? And debug and question profit. Yes.
So, never having worked with these kind of things, I'm just wondering, what is the main benefits you get from this? Like, if you had a language that did not support AST Transform, what would you have to do to the libraries or to the code to?
Well, what you cannot do.
Yeah. Well, basically, these open up a lot of extra possibilities to actually extend what Groovy can do. Things that you wouldn't normally have just out of the box. Like one of the examples is the at singleton annotation, which provides you a singleton annotation without you ever even writing it. It just transforms your class and puts in the parts of code that you need for that at compile time, rather than either you writing it or having something generated or copy pasted. Or you could use like runtime metaprogramming, but you get the performance penalty for that because it basically just how Groovy works with that. Even though like in later versions of Groovy, there's invoke dynamic, which they use from Java 7, which is supposedly helps with that, like some of the dynamic stuff. Get you closer to the compilation part, but compilation you usually get the best performance out of it. Some things that you I wouldn't say that you can't do some of the things that I did without AST transforms, but it makes it more cumbersome. And this may the AST transforms, when you give an annotation to someone who doesn't know how to write the AST transforms, they can say, oh, I can use this annotation and it does this for me. And so it's another like different way of abstracting things. So the main thing is I'd say performance. It's a different way of extracting, which is compile time. So those are like the main benefits of it. So let's actually take a look at an AST transform. So the AST transforms, they have two components to them. There is the interface, which actually, let me make that bigger. Which there's some of this, some of this is just like kind of boilerplate. The retention policy source, I have no idea what that does. Well, also to mention this, there are some things like you may have questions that I have no idea what the answer is to. Like this, I don't know why I have to put this, but I've seen it in every AST transform ever. I do know what the target is. The target is basically what you are targeting for this AST transform. And there are several element types. So the ones that I know of that I've used are class, which is the class node, method, and field. So obviously method node, or if you're targeting a field. So those are like probably the three things that you would actually target with an AST transform, a local AST transform. When you're doing global, then you're targeting like any class, and that's a little different. I'll show you a global AST transform later.
So you don't know what retention does?
I don't know. I have no idea.
It's actually stripped off from the source after this stage. So source means that only when it's compiling, it's actually can act on this annotation. It
cool.
means runtime, you won't see this annotation at all. So there is a runtime, there is something in between. I don't remember what is that.
Okay.
So it's different stages at which it will rip off this annotation, and so it won't exist later on.
Okay. Now I know that. See, all right. So another one, which actually this is an AST transform. Well, it's an annotation itself, but basically the Groovy AST Transform class. This tells you what class your actual transform will be in, which is this one up here, which is the fully qualified path. Then you have at interface and what you're calling your AST transform. In this case, it's config, and then here you have the parameters that are going into this. Now, for me, I have for this annotation, I have a string, just a value. Value is actually the default parameter that it sends in. If you have like just one parameter in your AST transform, when you're actually using it, you can not specify like what the parameters are. If you have multiple of them, you have to specify value equals this, fixed, whatever. In this case, it'd be fixed equals something. But it allows you to shortcut that. That's something they might change in later versions of Groovy. I've heard people talking about that. They might figure out a nicer way of putting it than the way they have it now, but we'll see. So obviously I have Boolean here, and I can also specify a default value, which in this case I'm defaulting it to false. And just to explain this transform that I'm going to actually show you that I called config, this was just one of the things that I played with because there's an annotation in Spring which allows you to get a configuration, and its syntax is a little bit weird because it's a single quote $, curly brackets, whatever the path to your actual value in config is. And basically, it only pulls that out at not runtime, but like deploy time. You only get it once, and then it's like fixed for until you restart your program or server. But I wanted to have an annotation that would allow you to pull something out dynamically, because with Grails you can actually have it pull a configuration and update it dynamically. So I have this one which creates the annotation creates it so you can do both, and I didn't put that in the documentation. But what it does is so you can have it dynamic by default, but if you put it to fixed, it'll actually put in the Spring annotation for you at compile time. So this happens without anyone seeing any of it, but it allows you to do some it's just a little cleaner than I thought than the other one, and gives me the best of that one, both worlds. So this is the actual transform itself. And with it, I have a couple AST transforms on it. I'm using compile static. Generally, it seemed to be a good idea to use compile static on these because it makes compilation faster and things of that nature. You can do it without it. You can just use dynamic Groovy, but in this case, I was able to do it with compile static with no big issue. The compile phase for most of my transforms, I've used Semantic.
Increase your font a little bit?
Increase the font size.
There's a presentation mode.
What?
IntelliJ has a presentation.
Yeah, I know. I don't like its presentation mode because it hides things that I'm going to need to access later, and I'm going to have to switch back and forth. So I'll just increase the font. Anyways, so like I was saying, so semantic analysis is what I have most of them, just because I found most of my AST transforms work well with that. Until I found that one of my AST transforms crossed with compile static, or no, compile static. It was Grails at transactional AST transform, and if I pushed it out to the next one, it worked. So, basically that's something, if you have these AST transforms, like multiple on the same method or class, you might come into, issues with them, being incompatible with each other. So it's one thing to keep in mind. And sometimes switching to, like, the next compile phase or the previous one may help you. It's also good to see what they're doing. So, obviously use the source and look down into what they're doing. So with that, I extend the abstract AST transform, which gives me the basic setup. The way AST transforms work is they work on this what's called the visitor paradigm. So basically, you visit each of the nodes that you're actually hitting. So as I showed you before, we're going after fields. So this will be hitting fields that are annotated with this particular annotation. And there's some basic, just like, there's, checking of nodes. This is stuff that I've pulled from every one that I've seen, which, you check to see that you're actually, hitting the node that is, actually annotated with the, config annotation. So other than that, then I actually pull off the field node, because this is the thing I'm going to be messing with. And let's see, so where do I want to go with this? So with this, like, this is what I said is some of this gets very, there basically there's like three different types of things that you actually work with these AST transforms. You work with nodes, which are usually like the class node, the method node, the field node. Then you work with, below that, there'll be statements, which, like, if you're adding to a method, there's a block statement, and you add statements to that. And of these, statements, they're usually made up of expressions. So those are the various component pieces that, each one of these actually uses. Okay, so let's see. So I get the annotation, I get the member. All right, so with this, the config path, so this, with this particular one, I have to remember how this one works. But the config path, which this is, I'm getting the, from the annotation node, I'm getting the member, and it's actually kind of important to use this one, the actual one, rather than just doing .member. And I'm getting the value of it and getting the text. So this is how I get the parameter of this string value over here, and I get the text of that. So and in here I also get the whether it's fixed and check that, and basically from that I either add my annotation, which I have the field node, which I pulled out before, and default value. Where did I get default value? Default value expression? No. So yeah, but I get that from the field node. Oh yeah, because with this particular AST transform, basically I have the field, and if I set anything equal to it, I take that as its default value, so that it'll actually set that up for me as well. So with this, basically one of the things that I found that was particularly interesting, which actually I know there's within, like, I think it's the Grails AST Transform utilities. They'll do some of these for you, but it's like I didn't know that those existed, so I wrote my own, and it's like, well, I figured for the purposes of demonstration, these are probably better because you can see how they're actually working. One of the things I'm actually adding is the Grails application, because that's where I'm going to get the actual Grails application or config from. And basically, I'm going to add a property node, which since Spring will see this node later on, it'll auto-wire it, and it'll be the Grails config. So actually, with this particular code right here, what I'm doing is I'm getting the Grails application class, and I'm getting its class. I'm creating a class node to get its class node. Then I'm creating a new property here, which with these, like I had to look up like the, and here's a good, showing of what they have for documentation. There is none, but to see what the actual parameters it takes. And for some of these, I've looked them up online. It's like, all right, what are other people doing? I look at other AST transforms just to build up on my own, just because for some things, like I said, they're not well documented. So, but with this, it's like, oh, I found you have to use the accessor public, and there's initial values, getter block, setter block. Which in this one, I'm not actually setting any of that because that kind of just gets set up for me by Spring, luckily, because it does the auto wiring later. So that's one of the things. That's how I'm actually getting the config in here. And then I write an actual, excuse me. I write a getter, which I'm adding this particular, with this one, what I'm doing is I'm taking the field and I'm getting the class node of the field, and I'm adding a getter to that. So this is just me trying to write the name of the method that I'm gonna that I'm creating, and basically I add that method, which I'm creating like a method node here, which I'm making it public. I'm not sending any parameters or classes, and then I have I'm delegating another method to actually create the actual, this is the expression, this is the statement that goes into that method. So you usually have a block statement, and I'm providing the statement, or actually no, it's an expression statement in this case. So with this is me writing the code that's actually going in the getter method. And with this is where we get into the expression. So I'm getting this expression, which is a variable expression, and I'm calling a method expression on that, which is Grails application, making another method call off of that, which is going to get config, and then I'm making an argument list, which actually I'm pre-populating here, which is probably not the best way, but this is one I was just playing with. And I'm actually adding the constant expression and the class, or adding the config path as this is a constant expression, which is a string, and then the type, which is a class expression, which is what that actually needs. Now, figuring all this out is kind of a pain. Probably a good way to do this, yeah.
So am I right that at the end of that, you build the structure,
yes,
compiler building by that time if you give some expression to that?
Build at that time if it gives some expression. Well,
so it takes some expression from your source code, it's building this kind of structure.
Yeah, it's building
parsing
this.
It.
Yeah, it's building it, well, it's not parsing this. This is building the AST that's actually going to go, I'm making a method out of nothing, putting it on this field's class, which is this getter method, and I'm taking these expressions and putting that into that method.
So if you actually write the code for this method,
yes,
and then compile that,
yes,
the parser by this time in compilation process will create the structure out of your method which you wrote.
No.
So you're imitating that this code actually was written.
Yeah, I am imitating that this code is actually written. So I am generating code, from nowhere.
So what was the expression you built here?
This is a getter expression for going into Grails, getting the Grails application, going get config, and then giving it the config path, which is the path to whatever the configuration is, and a class type, which will determine what type it's going to course it as. So that's the actual expression this will actually write. And actually, I think now that I've gone through one of these, which you see is kind of complex, I think it might be good to actually show an example of how you can actually look at these and see what it's doing, and let's see, and actually debug into it. So first thing I'm going to do is I think it's in test service. Was it in test service? No, it's not in test service. It might be in one of the controllers. Test controller. Yes, test controller. Okay. So these are the actual annotations that I have. This is the annotation I have that uses that AST transform. So with this, since this one, I'm only just passing the value, I'm not passing the extra one, I don't have to specify value equals. So let's, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the Groovy console, the console, which this is just running the console command for Gradle, which will work in, it'll work in Grails applications, and it should work in, if you had a Groovy-based application as well. If you have Groovy, you could just run, the actual Groovy console from the command line as well. But I'm going to run that, and so let's get that up and running. Okay, so how am I doing on time? This is only 6:43. Okay. I'm just going to copy that. Come on. Oh, yeah, I forgot. This is one of the things that, because I have a couple of lines, which I'm going to show you later about that are for debugging, I actually have to set the remote debugger to run, because otherwise it's not actually going to run my code. Okay. And, oh crap. Okay, we don't want to debug you right now. That was something else that I was playing with, so let's rerun that, because I don't really care about that right now. Okay. Well, while that's running, I'll just show you these two lines. Now it comes up. So actually, I'll go back to this. These are the two lines which are in the notes that you need to do remote debugging. And these are actually important if you want to actually debug through the AST transform itself, which I'll show you in a little bit. But going back to this sample class right here, and
Did you just paste that in there?
yeah, I just pasted it in there.
Right.
Let's see, view, what is the Control-Shift-L? Control-Shift.
I thought maybe it automatically. Did it? Oh, okay. All right.
Control-Shift. 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 Nope, no. You have to copy and paste it. There isn't anything special that does it for you. I actually put in a request to IntelliJ. It's like, it'd be really cool if you had this console in in IntelliJ. Not this part, but the part I'm about to show you, which is called Inspect AST, which is the AST browser. Which, where did it? Did I not click that? Come on. Are you off?
Control C.
Maybe it's behind the window.
I don't see it anywhere, and it didn't. Wait a minute. Let's see. Oh, it is somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes. Where it is a question. Where did it put it? Okay, I don't see
It's
it.
probably hiding behind something.
Yeah.
Can you just minimize those windows? And then you might see it.
I don't know where it put it, though, because all right, let's see if other actions, move to this desktop. Ah, I got it.
Ta-da.
So actually, let's,
That looks familiar.
and I think I had the other one here, so now I have both of them. Okay. Yeah, doing multiple desktops on multiple things, sometimes it does some things screwy. All right, so this is what you have for the AST browser, and you can actually look at every different compilation level. So after parsing, there is no AST yet. After conversion, then you start getting some type of stuff in here, which you start seeing class node, and I don't know. Let's see if I can make this bigger. Oh yeah, I can. Control Shift down, so that we can actually see it. I'll blow this up. So basically, you can go through and see like at the different levels. So I'm going to look after semantic analysis, and this is after my AST transform has actually run. So with it, you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff that you've probably never seen before unless you've actually looked at the AST. Things that come out of like, oh, wait a minute, this is calling this object because you called it def. And I think in one of the later ones, it actually adds semicolons too, so it gets to look a lot more like Java. So with this, basically, I had my, let's see, where is it? So this is the config, annotation, value, and all that. And it basically, you can see that it added the Grails application. And here's the actual getters that I added. So this is the expression that I was building up in that long block of code. So I'm doing, this .grails application .get config .get property, whatever the path is, whatever I'm coursing it as, and if it has a default value. So it's a lot of work to get here, but for the person who's just using this, I can just use this rather than I think the one that's what was it? That Spring gives you by default looks kind of like this. And test.
You don't need to give dollars. You can just give the name of property.
What's that?
You don't need to give the dollar sign to it. You just give the name of property, whatever you want to do.
I'm not sure about that. Yeah, but it's in single quotes. It's not. This is not a groovy string. So I've seen this, and it's like I looked at this, and it's like this just looks weird to me. If you can get away with not putting the dollar sign, great. But it just looked weird to me, and that's what I've seen other people do in another presentation.
And you can refresh at the runtime also. If you change your config files, if you put there at the top annotation refresh scope, it will refresh whenever you change that.
Well, see, I didn't know that. So, but basically, I made mine just have these getters, which gets it dynamically. Like I said, this may not be an actual useful AST transform because it was just something I was playing with. But I think it's useful for the demonstration purpose of, wait a minute, no, wrong window. Now I have too many windows. The demonstration purpose of this is like probably one of the smaller AST transforms that I have. Some of them get a little bit more complicated, this depending on what you're doing, because all this one is doing is it adds an annotation and it adds a method call to the class. So it adds a couple things to your class. So let's see, let me go back to my notes. So talked about types, nodes, expressions. I showed you the Groovy console. Debugging. So actually, yeah, that's something good to go probably do next. So, you know, with this, like I showed you with the console, you can see what it generates, which can be very useful for especially even the built-in annotations when it's like you want to see what those are actually doing and adding to your code, because sometimes it's like, is this doing what I think it's doing? You don't know, but this allows you to peek back behind there. So, where's my cursor? So, like I said, to do the debugging, you need these two lines here, and with this this actual whole entire project is listed on the Meetup, so that you can download this project, look at the AST transforms, use this in debugging, so you can use this as a test bed yourself. But with that, what was it? I think I put somewhere here, I think I actually made like the serialized version of basically the I think the boot run and the remote debugger. But the remote debugger, if you just create a new remote debugger and take the defaults, it works. Especially if you actually use this code. If you change anything in here, then you have to, you might have to change that, because I think it's just the port that it uses by default. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to go into my AST transform and I'm going to set a breakpoint here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the console, and I'm going to, wait a minute, that was the run, and I'm going to stop the debugger. As whenever you put those two lines of code, you always have to start the remote debugger, because it won't start your stuff, but even compiling it before you start the debugger. Which is why sometimes it's nice to comment those out if you're not actually debugging. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a boot run from the Grails application, which is just going to run the application. So I'm just going to run that. I don't think I don't even have to set it to be debug, because it's going to set that for me regardless. And then I'm going to go to the remote debugger, which actually I'll show that just so you can see what it actually. Oh, tell me it's not putting. Oh, thank God. Because I was hoping it wasn't putting it somewhere else that I couldn't see. So the remote debugger, this stuff it gives you all by default. So that's just the configuration, which actually looks a lot like those two lines. And basically I'm just going to run that. I'm going to debug that. And it stops right in your AST transform. So you can actually debug these things and see what you're actually getting. In terms of nodes, actually I kind of glossed over this, but usually the first node is your annotation. Wait a minute. The first node is your annotation node, and the second node, which is like node 1, is usually what you're actually manipulating. So the field, the method, or the class. The source unit is the compilation unit, which has a lot of extra stuff, which I don't think I use all that much. Let's see. What do I use the source unit for? Nothing in this particular this AST transform. It is useful for other ones. I don't remember exactly what for, but if you look through some of my annotations, you'll see the use of the source unit. It's actually more useful in the, I believe it's in the global AST transforms, where you get, essentially every class. So with this, now I can actually debug this, and let's just do F6. Now I have my field node, so I can, check this out, see what's on my field node, get a bunch more, information about it. You can, just any debugging, you can come up here and, see, whatever you want, manipulate things, how you would debug pretty much anything, which can be very useful with AST transforms when you're wondering what the hell is this actually doing. And since it is a little bit more complex. So that's debugging, not really much to say other than that, but it allows you to manipulate and play with things. So let's see, let's go back to my notes. So now I'm going to actually go into a more complicated AST transform, my enforcer AST transform. This one is for the plugin I wrote called Enforcer, and actually Grails plugins. And I just want the, where is it? Why don't I see the, well, I guess I'll go to source. They changed that most recently. I just wanted to get to the documentation so I can actually scroll down and show you the annotation itself. So with this annotation, this is probably one of the more complicated ones I wrote. It actually takes up to 3 closures. And basically it executes the first one as a predicate, and the second one is if that predicate fails, if it's false, and the third one is if it succeeds. And the default for failure is throw an exception, and the default for success is just return true in a closure, which is essentially a no-op. So with this, since it is a little bit more complex, you're adding a closure, there are some special things that you need to be aware of. So let's actually close some of these so I can get to the... So this is same as before. The only thing for the actual closures, the parameters, it's called class. I don't know why. That's another thing I might ask is like, why is it called class? Why isn't it closure here? I don't know. It just is. It's one of those odd things. Like I said, with me going to the G3 Summit, I have many questions I want to ask them, which some are related to this as well. So with this, basically, I'm going to scroll down to here, which this is where I'm pulling out, I have a map of members, which is the actual closures themselves, and I'm putting this into a list. So that's actually not the interesting part. But one of the things that I found when you're actually dealing with these closures is the closures have a variable scope associated with them, which is essentially like what they're delegated to. And when you're writing them in the annotation, they don't have any scope, so they don't know what they're actually supposed to delegate to. So with that, when you actually write this, there is a helper class. Let's see. So I have that right down here, which is the variable scope visitor, which, from my understanding, all this does is it goes through the class that you give it and make sure that all the variable scopes line up. So when I actually inject the code that calls this closure, it makes sure that the variable scope that it has is actually correct and delegating to something so that basically for this, like when I have well, this one's a bad example, but say I had a parameter here that I wanted to actually use here. Say I had like test user was something that was sent into some method, and I wanted to use that here. I actually have to set the variable scope of this to this. Now, there probably is some way to do this manually, and when I first tried doing AST transforms, I tried doing that, and the compiler said, I don't know what you did, but you did something wrong. This is probably a bug if it's in Groovy code. Please report it. And it's like, oh, great. That means I screwed up majorly. So with that, I later found through some blog posts that someone said, oh, use variable scope. And it's a variable scope visitor. And that just kind of magically fixes things. And it's like, that's one of the questions I have is this magic doing what I actually think it's doing? Which, it would make sense that it just goes through like all the code that you actually injected and make sure that the variable scope is what it would be if it was actually just there. So with this annotation, which is slightly different than the other one, it's a lot more complex. This one I actually go through and with it, it's I have it actually targeting type, which is class, and method, which is obviously a method. That's one thing I forgot about, is type is actually class. So some of these names don't always necessarily match up. So you have to figure out which one actually attaches to what. But now you know that, and you can go on with that. So and basically with this, what I did was I set it up so that I check in here. If it is a method node, then I just I apply the the actual AST that I want to that method. If it's a class node, I actually go through all of its methods and apply the AST transforms, unless it already has a method. So basically, or it already has an annotation. So this allows me to do like a class level annotation applying to all methods, but then override it at the method level if I choose. Or I could just apply it at all the method levels. So it gives me, that's one of the things that I can actually play with this. So with this particular annotation, what I did do though, actually what did I just do? No, I don't want that. What I did do was I actually, I have an enforcer service which I delegate to, so that I didn't have to actually do this code within my AST transform, because actually writing if-then statements in AST is very tedious, and it's you can do it. Don't get me wrong; it's perfectly possible, but from my experience, it was a little bit tedious of figuring out. Oh, I have to do like what was it? A variable statement and I can actually show you. So let me just pull up Groovy. So def bar equals false if bar So going back into the Groovy console, I can actually look at this, and here's my actual the actual code. And what this is actually useful for is I can go into this class node, and this shows me and what mine's in a method, which is a method it made, which is called run. So it has a block statement, which is what the method has, and it has an expression statement and an if statement. So we have the if statement, which has a block statement in it, which has an expression statement, which has a method call, which is the method call, and it also has the arguments and empty statement.
Else.
That's for the else. So, for this won't actually show you everything, but the things that you have to, some of the things that you have to set, but the Boolean and what that's made up of, which I think that is an expression as well, which is a variable expression, and as you can see, that some of this can get a little bit more.
You can expand it here. The Boolean has an error.
Oh, the Boolean wait a minute.
Yeah, there's an arrow next to the Boolean.
Lower.
Right. No, lower.
Here.
No,
Up.
this one.
Oh, this one.
Right, there's an arrow.
Oh, there is there. Yeah, it's kind of
Just a variable.
hard to see. So, so this one's just a variable, but obviously the more complex and what operators you have, then you have to deal with. All right, how do I write this operator in an AST transform? And you have to figure that out. This will help you do that, but obviously, if you can delegate some of the stuff to a method call, sometimes that might be a better way out than actually writing it in the AST transform itself. Okay. So let's see, what else is interesting? Oh, no, I don't want to save changes. So with this particular one, basically when I apply it to the method node, let's see, you get the before, so I check. This is where I'm checking to see if it's already been applied. What is this? Method node. I get the method node's block statement, and basically I add it to its block statement. This allows you to add it before. I also have another AST transform, which is reinforce, which does it after, so it does it as the last thing. And then I have another AST transform that allows you to actually change the return based on like some filtering. So that one's a little bit more complicated, and I'll skip going into that. But if you want to look into that, or if you have questions about that one, you can look into that one as well. And basically, they're all pretty much the same on in that case. And actually, this is where I create it, which is similar as the other one, where basically I'm just creating a method call here that I'm inserting at the beginning of that method. So, which is the call to the enforcer class or enforcer service. So, let's see. Go back to my notes. Okay, I'm going to actually skip those, and I'm going to talk about GDSL. This is one of the things that actually I can show you. Where did I put it? Grails.
What does it stand for?
It's a Groovy DSL for specifically for IntelliJ, and I'm not going to actually run this, but
for the IDE?
Yes. So one of the things that you'll notice is with this particular closure, actually let me make that bigger, it knows that isCreator actually exists as a method. It's not marking that as like squiggly underline, because with it I wrote a Groovy DSL which told it that this one actually goes to this trait, which, let's see, wait a minute. If I go to the enforcer service, this actually implements the creator trait. So I wrote a DSL which tells the IDE that my annotation has a closure which delegates to this service. So basically when I'm in the IDE, it doesn't look at the this and say, if I put like say is creator 2, it's like it doesn't know what that is. But if I created that method in that actual service or any of its traits, it knows that it delegates to that service and would say, oh, I know what that is, and doesn't mark it as an error. So with that, there's where is it? It's in. I put it in main. It's under main resource definitions .gdsl. This I actually asked someone at IntelliJ, how do I write this? And he's like, just do this. And it's like, ooh, now I have an example of that. And basically that is in the notes section. So with that, there are, there's one company called To The New. They did this really great blog write-up of a lot of different things that you can actually do with this GDSL. So when you're writing, whether it's runtime metaprogramming or compile time metaprogramming, you can tell the IDE what you're doing, and it will not mark it as an error, which can be very useful for the users of your DSL. So there is this, but the particular instance that I was looking for didn't exist in there, and it's like I couldn't. I looked at the documentation, and it's like I could not figure out how to do it. And there are limits to that the DSL. He told me there are certain things that you can't do with this, and it's like okay. We'll see if that's actually true once the next version of IntelliJ comes out, because I think I may have found a way to hack around it, but I could be wrong until I actually find that out. But this was the question I posed, and he answered, and he said, oh, just do this. And, basically, with it, I had the annotation name, which is obviously, this was enforcer, or actually, no, it is this. And it tells it that it delegates to, the class, which I had to find the class, which in here I knew the full path of it, so I just delegate to it. So it's one of those things if you're actually writing these and you have something in there, it's nice for your users. So that's GDSL. So let's see. All right, I'm going to move to one more. It's down here. One more AST transform, and this is a global AST transform. And this one I wrote for a plugin I wrote called Command. And what Command does, just so to give you a background on it, is it gives most things in Grails have a convention to them except for command objects. And it's like, why are command objects special in that sense that they don't have any convention to them? So this particular one added some convention to that. And one thing that I wanted to do was to make it so that for the actual command objects that you're creating, you wouldn't have to actually write implements. It's hard to say. Valutable. My AST transform will actually just do that for you. And actually, now that I think of it, this global transform is probably the simplest AST transform that I have, obviously in code-wise, because it's not doing all that much. So with this one, this is where I'm actually using the source unit, because this is how I've seen this done. But I think I can actually pull it off the nodes itself. And I don't know why you would do it this way, but this is what I saw someone else saying, oh, you should do it this way. So this is how I get the classes. But this visit actually gets, it comes here multiple times throughout the compilation, depending on how many classes you have on your build path. So I go through all of the actual nodes, and I have a command artifact, which I created for Grails. And basically, using this, I can check to see whether or not the actual class node is a command object based on the rules that I gave it. And then if it is, I check to see if it has a valuable interface. If it doesn't, I add it to it. So it's fairly simple in that respect. Now, one of the extra things that you have to do with global transforms in order for them to actually get picked up is you have to write this little piece of text right here, which goes in resources, meta-inf services, and then it's org, codehouse, Groovy Transforms, AST Transforms, and then you write the full path of the transform itself. One thing I didn't say before, but it is worth mentioning because I forgot to mention it earlier, is that all your AST transforms have to be precompiled before you actually run them against like something that's being compiled. So typically you'll put them in, say, either a library or a plugin or something like that. However, you're probably wondering how I actually pulled everything off in one class for the local AST transforms. I actually did, I found a way to actually have it do the pre-compilation within Gradle itself. So this I took from, I think it's, was it Mr. Hackey? He has a blog. He does a lot of really cool groovy stuff. And, I found this, and it's like, oh, I can just, have it do, the compilation, before me, and so that I can actually do all the local ones within this one project. So this project, which is listed in the notes, you get that. However, with the global AST transforms, they didn't play nicely with this. I don't know why, but basically when I got to it, it would run. However, none of the classes that were on my class path were actually available to it, and it's like it just blew up spectacularly. I'm like, okay. So basically, my test one for that is my command plugin, and I have the AST transform in here. I also have a test project that goes along with this so that you can actually test it, which actually brings me to another point. There is a particular AST test which I've actually never used, which allows you to emulate calling the annotation and stuff like that. I actually prefer writing just the. I don't know if it's actually if I have them in here. I hope I did a test command. No, I don't have tests in this project. In one of my other projects, I think it's the enforcer test, which I'll add that to the notes. I actually have some unit tests, and I actually just, for that, I just wrote like a class inline in my test, and I added the annotations to it, so I know it's actually running those annotations the way it would if it was actually running in a program, which actually I kind of prefer. Obviously, you could do more complicated things with Gradle multi-projects and stuff like that, and do things of that nature with building and running these, or like I had with the test project, which actually, now that I think of it, I have the test in here.
Specs.
Oh, of course. Well, it's the default for Grails. So, basically with this, I'm just, doing basic method calls, and it's like, I expect, it to return true or throw an error or something based on, what I set up the actual annotation to do. And this is just, testing my enforcer, annotation with just, basic trues, falses, and, having failure closures and stuff like that. So that's how I prefer to do these tests. Obviously, I've heard people do them slightly other ways with the, like, if you look at the Groovy does have like a section in their documentation, and they show you how to use the AST test if you actually want to do that. I prefer this because it's like this is how the code's actually going to be run if it's actually in your real project anyways. So,
just curious, did you write the test first?
No.
No, of course.
No, I don't write tests first. No. No, I'm not a TDD person. I write code and then I play with it, I debug it, and I evolve it because it's more for me. It's more of a creative process. But that's my personal
That's fine.
Yeah,
bias.
TDD, you need actually as a spec. You need to think through all the stuff first.
You can. I think of TDD as at the feature level, not at the unit test level. Although,
actually, you can go either
you can
way.
Go either way.
Yeah. So, with that, one of the things that I found out, which is coming up, it isn't here yet, are called macro methods, and I did find some actual documentation. Wait a minute, that's not it though. Of macro methods, and basically this is something I don't remember who did it, but on my Twitter feed. But someone wrote this as a separate library, and then actually it was the people at Groovy thought, "Ooh, that's a good idea," and ported it into it. I don't know how this works, but I know that it's supposed to make writing AST transforms a lot simpler. As you can see here, some of this looks, a little bit more compact than it did before. So this is something to look for in the future. However, if you want to do backwards compatibility, you're probably not using this. So, I have my AST transforms, some of them already written. I'm probably not going to port these to macro methods, because this isn't coming out till Groovy 2.6, which I don't know when it's coming out, but I know they just released Alpha 2 of that. So it'll probably be within the next year is what I'm thinking. I don't know exactly. I think 2.5 is supposed to come out relatively soon, like probably either the end of this year or beginning of next year.
So if you would rewrite, then it would limit the version of Groovy.
Possibly. Like, I could use the library that is separate, I think, but then, you have to add the library, trade-offs, like anything else. So for me, I'm going to keep my AST transforms the way they are for now. They are a bit complicated, and, as you seen, they can be a bit cumbersome, but they can also be very powerful, like especially with the enforcer example. So instead of actually, writing in line, call my service with all this, I just have like, the annotation, at top, similar to the Spring Security ACL annotations, which is why I wrote this, because those are horrible. Different talk. Any questions? Or have I thoroughly confused you? Or scared you away?
Do your examples work?
No, they don't work at all.
They don't work at all.
As you saw, I showed you one of them working.
Yeah. Well, no, the ones on GitHub, and so.
Yeah.
Oh, all right, cool.
Yeah, the examples pretty much work. There was some. I might have to actually change and do another commit. But because, as you saw, when I first ran it, it ran into an error.
Right.
That's because I was playing around with Enforcer and Compile Static. In the older version of Compile Static for Grails, I think 3.2, it worked. But once you went to 3.3, which had a newer version of Groovy, it broke, and they did something different. Basically, what I did for the @transactional was I actually told it, when you're done with my AST transform, delete the annotation, and so that it deleted it from the AST, because it was getting a static compilation from the @transactional. But even doing that, for some reason, the compile static still knew my code was there and said, nope, this is wrong. It's dynamic. I don't like you.
Oh.
So when I go to the G3 Summit, I'm going to be asking, is there a way around this? And that might lead me into actually something else I should mention, which is semi-related to this, type extensions. So Groovy has a way to extend its compile static and type checker with type extensions, so that when you have a DSL, you can tell the compiler that, hey, this is all okay, and things of that nature. There's also a hook in there, because this is very related to the ASTs, where you can actually manipulate the AST within these extensions. And if you could have some code that was dynamic and you can make it static, which is what is done in the JSON views. So in Grails, Grails added this idea of JSON views, which it's essentially it's a DSL. However, at compile time, they have a compiler, which is a type extension, which takes this code and manipulates it into AST, which is statically compiled. So you get the fancy DSL, which looks dynamic. However, it's actually statically compiled, so you get the performance benefit.
So back to your question, what you can do with that? Basically, you can rewrite the program, and whatever developer gives you, just ignore that completely and write your own.
Yeah, basically, this gives you immense power, like like any metaprogramming. So you could do bad things, and I've always had the idea of I wanted to write an AST transform that for Amrish, who is the architect, say, oh, today you cannot compile because you are management. You're no longer trusted. I never did this, mind you, but it's like I thought it would be funny to do that. I never actually did. It's like you're no longer really a developer. You're now management. So
okay, I still keep thinking practical reasons, but it sounds like these would be the kind of things that you want to do with libraries for which maybe you don't have the source code and you need to modify something on top of that?
No.
You just introduce new methods and you...
Yeah, but it's happened when you're compiling your code.
Your code. These are things that allow you to modify your code, not someone else's.
The runtime AST.
There's runtime metaprogramming, and then there's compile time, which is the AST transforms. AST transforms happen at compile time.
So what I'm talking about is the runtime metaprogramming.
Okay.
I think.
Maybe. Yeah. I haven't heard the question yet, so let's see.
So, no, I'm still trying to clarify in my head, the kind of, any of us people are not writing, frameworks or plugins.
Well, that's why I said these are, primarily written by framework developers, library developers, and things like that. Because, like I said before, I keep coming back to this example, which I think is a good one. It's like I don't ever want to write singleton again. Because it's like I don't remember exactly. I know there's a bunch of different things where I can screw it up. I do remember that much. I can go back and I can look at the algorithm and figure it out again. But it's like the annotation. I can just say, at singleton, and that provides me, a solid implementation that someone else already wrote. Like obviously, you could use, if you want to go, to that, you could use a, something like Spring or Grails that does dependency injection, and then all your services are singletons by default by the fact that they're in this framework. But basically that's just the example I'm using. Another one is the @toString, which provides you a nicer toString to a particular class without you having to write it. So that's one of the ones that's built in. For me, I got into it because I was looking at Spring Security ACL and I hated it because for one thing, I tried to extend it a couple times and failed horribly. I wrote the actual thing that supposedly I followed someone's tutorial, wrote the extension, put my little thing in there, and it didn't do it. And the other thing was because it was a runtime proxy, you can actually, with Spring Security annotations, if you're calling a method that's in the same class that you're in, it'll actually skip the annotation and go right in it. So you can get this false sense of security if you have, like, say, you have like a method that just does some checking of parameters, and then you send that to your real API method that you actually want to secure. And that was one of the things I found when I was actually using it, was it's like, oh, this isn't actually securing things. It just went through, and was a false negative. So with the AST transforms, it's actually compiling my check right in there. So every time you hit the method, it'll hit that security annotation, the code that came from that security annotation. And since it's compile time, it's fast enough. And since I made it so that it took closures, I could do like pretty much whatever I wanted in terms of what I would do for checks. So it's like if I wanted to check, if this is the current user, I could say, oh, is this current user? Are you an admin? Is the date this? Is there a midget in the room? Is whatever? Like when you talk about like business requirements for like permissions, you can go crazy with them. And in some businesses, they do go crazy with them. So that's why I wanted something that could be that flexible. And when I heard that you could use closures as parameters to AST transforms, I thought, ooh, well, that's interesting. And if I could figure out how to get that to work, I could write something that's better. So for me, it was all about, can I write something better than what was out there? For everyday use, you're probably not going to be using AST transforms. But if you get into a point where it's like, maybe I can write this better, or maybe it's something where it's like I want to provide a proven implementation and have my underlings use this implementation to make their life easier. Also with the other plugins I wrote, the command one, for instance. That one was just to make my life easier, so that when I deal with command objects, it had that convention. It's like I knew where they were, and I knew that they were all named something command rather than just random name. Or in our case, at our company, we have a user domain object, and we have a user command object, and the difference is the package. And when you try to pull that up in the IDE, it's like 50-50. Do I choose the one that is company name .security or com.something else? And it's like, I don't remember which. I'll choose this one. No, it's the wrong one. It's not like huge, but it's annoying. So
and additional annoying is when you need to use both as a piece of code.
Oh yeah, that's why I wanted to add this additional convention to it, and then I thought, well, if I'm adding that convention, it's like, why can't I just take out the valuable and just have you write it? It's kind of like how if you've seen the GORM, the Groovy domain classes. Those don't have any additional interfaces. They just derive based on what you put in there, what they are, and it makes the hibernate underlying calls and everything for you. So it's more about for me, the AST transforms are more about how do I make my code better, and how do you extend Groovy to do things it wasn't necessarily even meant to do. Out of the box, anyways.
And some boilerplate code.
Yes.
So when you get into the controller, you have to check all these parameters. So you write if this blah blah blah, then do the if this. So it's 2/3 of the method actually just this ifs, which is just validating.
Yeah.
And it's the same validation here, 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 and here. So instead, you have this annotation, which is outside of your method. So it's out of your reading of that, which does the same thing. And actually, it does that not at runtime with all the problems Tucker mentioned, but actually just build this if stuff straight in the code to compile. So it's not for you to write, and it's not there for you to read or somebody else to read, but it is there.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay.
I have an easy one.
Oh, no. Hey, come in.
So, what is happening with Groovy? Has he moved out of the Apache incubator stage? Is it a top-level project?
Yes, it did that a while ago. It's been a top level.
Quiet. I didn't realize it, although I've been following them.
Where have you been following them?
Oh, I mean, we've been following like tweets and.
Yeah, they did that. I don't know, a while ago. They went out of them. They've been a top level, which I think there was one tweet that this year, like, you know, in the few months alone, they had like more downloads than they did, like, you know, the prior 2 years or something like that. Since something like that. Well, it seems like there's you know, been like, since they become an Apache project, their downloads, you know, go up. And this isn't you know, necessarily a great metric because it doesn't take into account a lot of things. I don't think it takes into account you know, if you use SDK man or stuff like that. But, like, you know, it's just kind of a metric. It's like, you know, since they've gone to Apache, you know, a lot of companies have said, oh, hey, you're an Apache project. Well, now we can trust you. So I know that does sound weird, but some companies are like that.
Yeah, or maybe we just know that you are.
Yeah.
Exist.
Yeah, well, true. So, yeah, with the whole, like, pivotal debacle, which I think was 2 or 3 years ago, it actually ended up helping Groovy and Grails because basically Groovy became, you know, the Apache project. Grails got taken over by OCI, and OCI has a vested interest in Grails and developing it. And they hired, you know, the whole Grails team. They also hired Paul King to work full time on Groovy. So, you know, he was one of the biggest contributors to Groovy just in general. So he is one person to follow when it comes to Groovy stuff.
But unfortunately, there's still a bunch of Codehouse
links that are broken.
That are broken.
Yeah. Well, that part of that is unfortunate. It is what it is. You know, that was one of the downsides, and, you know, the other downside is like, oh, you know, Pivotal dumped you, so you must be not great. And, you know, people will use that excuse, like they used oh, what was it? I think his name was James something. But the original creator of Groovy once said, like, if I had known that Scala exists, I probably wouldn't have written Groovy. And it was like an offhand, taken out of context quote.
It wasn't Guillaume Lafort?
No, it wasn't Guillaume.
Oh, he wasn't the creator of Groovy?
Nope.
Oh.
No, he came afterwards. He was one of like one of the maintainers, and, you know, more of I think he became more management afterwards, but he's still a big figurehead in Groovy, even though he's less directly involved into it as from what I know right now. I think he works for Google right now. Yeah, no, he was not the original creator. Although later, you know, the same guy who created it and said that offhand tweet said, I still love writing Groovy. And it's like, I no longer even deal with that silly Scala stuff. I now, like, you know, I'm interested in Groovy. Kotlin looks a little cool. You know, he's one of those guys who it's like, you know, he'd probably, you know, do whatever. You know, obviously he's very smart to write the initial of Groovy, but, you know, a lot of people have contributed to Groovy over the years. Like, it's not just a one-man show. Compile Static came from Cedric Champeau. He did a lot of that work with that. I don't remember who did the Android work, but, like, someone did work on so that you could do, you know, Groovy with Android if you so chose. You know, and basically a lot of the other. I know that Paul King was one of the bigger contributors because he always has been, which is nice that OCI now sponsors him full time to work on this. So, like I said, Groovy and Grails ended up in a better place because Pivotal, which well, let's see, where did it start? I think it was G1 or G2 or something like. Actually, no, it's probably G2 something. Was the original company, which was a startup that started Groovy and Grails, or didn't start it, but I think started Grails, and that eventually got taken over by. What was it? VMware and Spring Source, which got taken over by VMware, and then they eventually spun it off to Pivotal. So it got passed around a bunch. Pivotal never really even used Grails, although I think they would benefit a lot from it. And they just had a recent talk with what was it, Josh Long? Yeah, who is one of he's he's a Spring Boot guy, and he's very like vocal in that community. But they did it with him and Jeff Scott Brown. It's like, oh, I do this in Spring Boot, and here's how you do it in Grails. And it's like, oh, isn't this so much nicer? It's like you get all this stuff for free, and kind of like that type of talk. So it's like I think Pivotal could have definitely benefited from Grails. And actually, if you look at Spring Boot, it rips off some of what Grails originally was, and is why Grails rebased on top of them, because it's like, oh, here's a whole bunch of functionality we no longer have to support because someone else does. And it wasn't stuff that they were particularly, super great at anyways, because it was just stuff that it's like, well, no one else wrote this, so we have to write our own build system. So they had to write that. But Gradle came along, and Spring Boot uses Gradle, because they had a long time where they wanted to switch off onto Gradle, but it's a huge project. So now they got that by default. They have the built-in Tomcat by default, which used to be a Grails plugin. So basically they got a lot of benefits of that. But now that they've spun off and got picked up by OCI, like I said, OCI is they're a consulting company, and they do a lot with Grails. So they have a vested interest in it, and they've been promoting it. They've been doing more talks, webinars. Like I've seen a lot more of those pop up. Some free. Some, obviously are paid for, but even some of the paid ones weren't even that expensive. There was one on metaprogramming, which I think included AST Transforms, probably to a lesser degree, because, maybe not, because I think it was 6 hours, and that was only $50. So, but yeah, so I think Groovy is in a decent place for now. It's just a matter of where you look for, news. Unfortunately, whoever wrote the Groovy diary stopped doing it, and which is unfortunate. So I've actually looked more towards Twitter, and I follow a whole bunch of people on Twitter, and I have a feed which comes up with a whole bunch of news, because it's I follow a lot of the top people, and they retweet a lot of what some other people I don't know do. So it's oh, hey, that person does that, and that, oh. So that's where I get most of my news. Other than that, I look at Slack a lot, and which is where people post questions, which there's the two forums for that. There's the Grails one and the Groovy one. And the Groovy one has a Grails channel too. So that's definitely something to check out if you haven't already. So random rant on Grails and Groovy. Any other questions?
When is Rick going to do his presentation?
Well, actually, while you were talking, I thought of the second one.
Oh, nice.
The second one that I will have a hard time finishing.
Oh, awesome.
I like to divide my lack of attention to two things.
All right, so it'll take you twice as long to do the one that you haven't finished.
Asymptotically approaching both.
I don't have a second kid, so I can only poorly raise
Yeah.
both.
Yeah, it's kind of like my side projects. It's ooh, shiny, I'm going to do this now.
Yeah.
I'm going to go do that. I have to come back to finish this.
Shiny
thing.
thing.
With Spring Boot starters.
Oh, yeah?
I've been doing some experimenting with Spring Boot starters for doing some things for stubs if you want to test something without actually having the whole system in there. So that's another thing that's half-baked.
Would you be willing to be my injection mold for the summit? If Ratpack is going to be there?
I'm not. Well, I went to talks on Ratpack. I'm not planning on going to them this time because there's other talks I want to go to.
Oh, okay.
So
I did have something to try and get them to do. For those who don't know, Ratpack is a program it's a framework like Sinatra for Ruby. Like Grails is Ruby.
Rails,
right? But Sinatra allows you to create REST APIs really easy. Well, Ratpack allows you to create REST APIs, but it also uses Jetty, which does asynchronous calls. So it's much
Wasn't
more
it
performant.
Netty?
Netty, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Netty, which is based on
which
Jetty.
I don't have a lot of experience,
Right,
but I
you're
think
right,
it's Netty.
You're right, it's Netty, which is based on Jetty. So the problem, though, is that all these other tools like Sinatra and other REST API creation tools in other languages they've embraced Swagger. And Swagger is a technology that allows you to define with a YAML format the REST API, right? And there are all these tools that work with Swagger. There's like a tool to validate that the REST API is doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? So why write back-end tests if your developers are creating Swagger? Well, now there's tools to even create code right from the Swagger. Well, the problem is Sinatra has embraced Swagger and many of these other things because it's become a standard, but Ratpack has not.
Mm-hmm.
And so they need a little nudging to try and get onto the bandwagon, because that's a major problem when you're dealing with enterprises. They're looking for, architects, they're looking for technologies that they can leverage to make it more efficient down the road for testing and for everything else. But Ratpack is, for documentation. So
the one person I think, actually, let me, do I have that up? No, I don't, but I can get it up. G3 Summit. Let's see, I think he's coming to this one, or maybe not. Speakers, I don't see him on the list. Well, let's look at sessions, see who's doing
Ratpack. No, I don't see any.
They did last year, but maybe not this year. But the person who did it last year was Dan Woods. Do you know who he is?
Yes. Yeah, he's a major.
So
contributor.
he's probably one of the people you might want to bug. Luke Daly, yeah, he's so you might want to bug those people on their respective Twitters, and I don't know. I don't think I've seen Dan on the Slack channel, but he's probably there. But I haven't. He's a big personality from what I understand.
Dan?
So, yeah.
Oh. Okay.
In general, his personality.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Are you trying to criticize him, or are you saying that's a good thing? Because I've heard it used both ways.
I've heard it used both ways. I've heard it used both ways too. I don't really know him personally. I don't know him really well personally, but I know that he's somewhat popular. But I know that they made fun of him on the Groovy podcast, and I'm assuming obviously it's light banter, but They had this one running joke of every day unfollow Dan Developer. The only problem is every day you have to follow Dan Developer, which is obviously Dan Woods.
Right.
But that's Ken Cousin and Baruch, and I don't remember Brooke's last name. Baruch has a very big personality too. He's you know, I don't want to say loud, but he projects, and he's one of those people who's very animated, interesting to listen to and talk to, and so take that for whatever it's worth. You know, most of the people I've met in the Groovy Grails community have been very nice, very helpful. Like I don't think I've met one person who's, you know, it's like, oh, I don't want to talk to you at all. Like I've went to one talk where it's like, I don't want to go back to the talk, but it's like, I know this person is immensely smart. I will not mention his name because we're recording. But, like, you know, his talk wasn't that great, but, you know, some people aren't that great at talks. There was another person whose talk was, oh my God, it was horrible. But I also knew, you know, just by what he commits, very smart guy. But some people, they're not great at talking. These people, you know, obviously are some of them are better than others. Venkat obviously is known to be a speaker and a consultant. But basically all of these people, like, I've seen them talk, and, you know, they're good speakers. So obviously only you are going, but you'll get to see. So there's no one on here that'd say don't go to their talk. So, you know, luckily that has been the case for most of the G3 summits that I've been to. Or, well, actually, this is only the second one. It used to be Spring 1.2 GX, but whatever.
A lot of OCI.
Well, yeah, because they're the ones who do grooving Grails. You know, now they're one of the biggest supporters. So, and obviously there's some of the usual suspects like Ken Cousin, Paul King, which obviously he's OCI. You know, Graham Roche. He's OCI. He's like the head of Grails. Jeff Scott Brown is like he was like the co-founder of Grails. Another very smart person, and he's also very helpful on the Slack forums. He won't answer all your questions, though. He didn't answer my enforcer question. I figured it out myself. He's like, I have no idea what enforcer is. No. But, you know, obviously when I go to the conference, I can ask these people and corner them.
Gave it a less threatening name.
Yeah.
Well,
Fuzzy Bunny.
Fuzzy Bunny.
Yeah, but I wanted something that sounded cool, and I thought enforcer sounded cool. Actually, the first implementation I wrote was called Bouncer, because it's like a bouncer at like, you know, a bar. And that one I thought was funnier, but, you know, Nielsen owns that one because, well, actually Affinova owned it, and Nielsen owns Affinova because there is no more Affinova. And basically, I wanted to release it as open source, but the legal red tape of the acquisition ground that to a halt. So I said, okay, I'll rewrite it from scratch and write it better and release it on my own. So that's what I did.
Passive-aggressive programming. That's
It's like,
so
fine.
I might try next one just calling it Rabbit Badger. See how far you can go with it. Yeah.
Well, actually, I don't know what the next one is. But I wrote Enforcer, I wrote the command plugin, and I wrote a Groovy config writer. This was one, I actually eventually found there is a Groovy config writer in Groovy, but it didn't quite do what I wanted. So, you know, I wrote my own anyways. And basically I used it in the to extend the external config Grails plugin so that basically you can take the YAML that Grails produces and just convert it to Groovy, because I don't like YAML. Significant white space is one of those things. It's like you took the worst part of Python and you put it into my config format. So I prefer Groovy.
Yeah, I do too. But it's Groovy's almost very similar to JSON, only it's less verbose.
It can be. It depends on what you're doing. But, you know, Groovy gives you a lot more flexibility, and that's what I wanted in my, and this has changed over time with the way Grails actually does things, because they actually split it into two files. It used to be config.groovy, which became application.yaml, or application.groovy in Grails 3. And then I think in 3.2 somewhere they split it into application.yaml and runtime.groovy or YAML. The reason being was the application one had stuff that you could use on the command line, and had, basically it had nothing that could it couldn't call out to classes. So if you wanted to do like say decrypt a parameter, you couldn't do that in application.groovy anymore because of the changes they made. So they made runtime.groovy, which allowed you to still maintain that. It's like they asked, it's like, are you gonna be mad that we have like 2 files now? It's like, no, I actually kind of want to break my stuff up anyway, so this is good.
Do you have an example of a DSL where you've written documentation for the DSL and showed it?
No.
Okay.
The closest thing I have to a DSL is Enforcer and its annotation. Obviously, you can check out the documentation I have for that, but it's the documentation I wrote for that. So,
what do you mean documentation for DSL?
Yeah,
DSL is just classes and functions, so you have documentation for that.
Well,
yeah.
DSL is your own language, so it's it's a configuration. It's
it depends on
how you implement it.
Yeah.
So, but it's your own language.
Yeah.
And so with any language, you want to have a way to document it so people know how to use the statements and the configuration, how to properly configure and use the DSL that you've created. Yeah. Right? And so, but I find that there's a disconnect. It's like, how do I create documentation for the DSL?
For me, just me off the top of my head, I would say it would be how you'd write documentation for anything. Like personally,
well, it's not like Java docs or Groovy docs.
No.
So,
I wouldn't do that.
So why isn't there an extension for Groovy docs that allows creating documentation for the DSL that you've created using Groovy?
Good question. Someone has to write it.
Okay.
Maybe you'll write it.
Maybe I'll write it. Because there's a need there, right?
Yeah, well,
you really want to be able to document your DSL.
But
I found DSL documentation to be lacking.
Yeah.
It's like it doesn't. Although Gradle is a DSL and there's documentation there, but it's like they didn't use a program to like figure out.
Yeah.
Because basically DSL is just mismatch of different classes, different methods, which basically not related to each other.
Which means that there's some interpretation that you have to do
Right.
when you look at the classes to say, oh, this class relates to this object in the.
Well, and that might be there might not be
a
a good way to derive it. Like there probably is, and if you were to derive it. AST Transforms might be a way to actually derive whatever it is your DSL is actually doing and write some, you could probably have an AST Transform write documentation for you. I haven't tested this theory, but something I'm just kind of spitballing. It's probably something you could do. A matter of if you want to do it and how you go about it, it might be a little sticky. But what I've found for most documentation, especially in the Groovy and Grails, ecosystem that's caught on big. Most of them use ASCII docs as like just their default go-to for whatever they do for documentation, because there's a standard template that they use. I ripped it off from Bert's plugin, Spring Security's core, and I just use it in all my plugins. So I use his template. Because obviously that's the great thing about open source is like, hey, you use this, so do I.
So you get a whole bunch of things that get abandoned at the same time. Whoever just stops maintaining the tool you're using for doing it.
Well, no, I'm not using it. Well, I'm just using the only thing I stole from him was like the layout, the CSS stuff. ASCII Doctor is a completely separate project.
That's what I mean. Like sometimes you have a whole bunch of stuff done, and then somebody thinks more about it.
Yeah, but with ASCII Doctor, it's a generation tool, so it generates HTML. So It's a syntax. I think before, like, I think it was Groovy, not Groovy Docs, but or GDoc or something, which was it was based off of I think it was something called restructured text, and it's like no one used it. So same thing. It's like once that was like kind of died off, it's like, oh well, now I have to port my documentation to something else. How do I do ASCII Doctor? And because that became it became more standard, because it seems like it's being used even more than just within the Groovy community. It's being used through the open source community.
But it's
You can
Ruby.
create-
It's
Yeah.
not Ruby.
It's actually implemented in many different languages.
Languages,
It is?
yeah.
Yeah, and you can create HTML and you create PDF from the same text.
Yeah,
Which
or
is nice.
like EPUB. There's
Yeah.
there's
So-
a whole bunch of like formats you
So
can
you
like.
can publish that online, or you can print books,
Yep.
or distribute as a books. EPUB.
Yep. Okay. Any other points of conversation or talk? Because this has devolved into something else, which is fine.
So
So?
ASCII Doctor is a Groovy. There's a Groovy DSL for ASCII Doctor. So in order to create a documentation for my DSL, I need to use
A DSL.
a DSL to create my documentation.
Hopefully they have a
for the
good documentation for their DSL.
Yeah.
It's turtles all the way down.
All right. I'm going to stop the recording if I can find my cursor there and say, I guess that's it for this meetup, and hopefully we'll have another one sometime in the future. Thank you.